The morning Virginia Baker decided to leave Redemption Creek was the same morning she made herself a promise she intended to keep, which was to never again let a place or a person hold her somewhere she did not choose to be. She had come to Redemption Creek in the spring of 1882, riding the Southern Pacific Rail line from San Antonio with 2 carpet bags, a leather satchel, and the stubborn conviction of a woman who had rebuilt herself from ash once before and was not afraid to do it again. She was 28 years old, with dark auburn hair that turned almost copper in the afternoon sun, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, somewhere between brown and green depending on the light and depending on her mood. She was not a fragile woman. She had never had the luxury of fragility. Her husband, Thomas Baker, had died 14 months before her arrival in Redemption Creek. Pneumonia had taken him in the January of 1881, and it had taken with him the small dry goods store they had operated together in San Antonio, because it turned out the store had been mortgaged twice over, and the debts were not something Virginia had known about until the lawyers came to the door with their papers and their practiced expressions of sympathy that did not quite reach their eyes. She had sold everything that could be sold, paid what she could pay, and stepped out of that life the way a person steps out of a house that is already burning, cleanly, quickly, without looking back. Redemption Creek, Texas, had advertised for a schoolteacher in the San Antonio Daily Express. Virginia held a certificate from the Texas State Board of Education, had taught briefly in San Antonio before her marriage, and saw no reason why that chapter of her life could not be reopened in a new place. The town was small, perhaps 300 souls tucked into a bend of the Pecos River basin, but it had a schoolhouse, a church, a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Blue Rooster that smelled of sawdust and spilled whiskey, a doctor's office, and a handful of other establishments that made the kind of life out here feel, if not comfortable, at least functional. She had been told before she came that the town's surrounding lands were cattle country, that the ranches ran for miles in every direction, and that the men who worked those ranches were of the sun-baked, leather-skinned, quiet-spoken variety that tended to mind their own affairs and expect the same courtesy in return. She had not been told about Vernon Bancroft. Vernon Bancroft owned the Banked Fire Ranch, which sat 5 miles east of Redemption Creek along a stretch of land so flat and golden it looked like the earth had been ironed smooth. He was 32 years old when Virginia first saw him, which was a Tuesday in April, 3 days after her arrival, when he rode into town for supplies, and she was standing outside the general store trying to negotiate the weight of 2 bags of flour she had purchased for the school's end-of-year social. He was not a tall man by theatrical standards, but he was broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked every single day, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that needed shaving, and hands that were the hands of someone who had built things and fixed things and held things that were heavy. He swung down from his horse a patient gray gelding named Dust, she would learn later, and he took one look at the situation she was in with those flour bags, and without a word or a dramatic display, he simply picked them both up and asked her which direction she needed them taken. She told him the schoolhouse. He walked with her the 2 blocks to the schoolhouse, set the flour bags inside the door, tipped his hat, said it was no trouble, and left. That was it. That was the whole of their first meeting. But she thought about him the rest of that week in the way you think about a song you only half heard, trying to remember enough of the melody to name it. She learned his name from Clara Hutchins, the wife of the town's blacksmith, who was the kind of woman who believed firmly that information was best shared freely and generously. Clara told her that Vernon Bancroft had run the Banked Fire Ranch alone for the past 4 years, since his father passed, and before that had run it beside his father for 8 years before that. He had no wife, had never had a wife, though Clara said this not as a judgment but as a simple statement of fact. He had a hired hand named Emilio Reyes, who had worked the ranch alongside the Bancrofts, since before Vernon was old enough to ride, and 2 other seasonal hands who came and went. He sold beef cattle to the railroad buyers who passed through twice a year, and he did not come to town more than once a week for supplies and occasionally on a Sunday for church, though he sat in the back and left before the socializing. Virginia filed all of this information away without examining it too closely, because she was not in Redemption Creek to examine men. She was in Redemption Creek to teach and to rebuild and to be, for the first time in her adult life, entirely her own. The school year in Redemption Creek ran from September to late May with a break at Christmas, and Virginia threw herself into it with a dedication that surprised even herself. She had 17 students ranging from age 6 to 14, children of ranchers and storekeepers and the occasional Mexican farming family who lived along the creek bottom, and she taught them reading and arithmetic and geography and history with the kind of focused intensity that comes from a woman who has nothing else to fill her evenings with. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The children responded to her the way children respond to adults who take them seriously. Vernon Bancroft came to town on his regular Tuesdays and sometimes Saturdays, and sometimes their paths crossed, and sometimes they did not. When they crossed, he was always polite and occasionally helpful in the same low-key, unremarkable way he had been with the flour bags. He fixed the wheel on the schoolhouse supply cart once when she was struggling with it. He traded umbrellas with her in an unexpected rainstorm when he walked out of the general store and found her drenched and her good umbrella broken beyond functioning, and he insisted she take his oilskin jacket instead. She tried to return it the following Tuesday, and he said she should keep it until the rain season passed. By June, she had the oilskin jacket hanging on a peg by her door like it belonged there. She told herself none of this was remarkable. Men in small towns helped women with things. It was the way of things. There was nothing to read into it. The summer of 1882 passed long and golden and sometimes brutally hot, the way West Texas summers do. Virginia spent her days reading and writing letters to her sister in Memphis, and occasionally helping Clara Hutchins with the preserving, which was something she had learned to do in San Antonio, and which gave her hands something useful to do in the long afternoon hours. She went to church on Sundays and to the occasional social. She was not lonely exactly. She was something more complicated than lonely, which was the feeling of someone who has chosen solitude because it is safer than the alternative, and who sometimes, in unguarded moments, misses the alternative very much. It was at a 4th of July gathering in the town square, with a fiddle player named Sam Dorsey sawing away at a lively reel, and children chasing each other through the legs of adults, and the Blue Rooster having donated 3 kegs of its better beer to the celebration, that Virginia Baker and Vernon Bancroft first had a real conversation. She was standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of lemonade, watching the dancing rather than participating in it, when he appeared beside her in the manner he had of arriving quietly as if he had been there a moment before she noticed him. "You do not dance," he said. It was not a question exactly, but it had the inflection of someone testing a theory. "I dance," she said. "I choose not to tonight." He considered this. "Is there a difference?" "There is a considerable difference," she said. "One is a limitation and the other is a decision." He was quiet for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was in the direction of one. "That is a fair distinction," he said. They stood together watching the dancing for a little while, and then he asked her how she found Redemption Creek, meaning the town, the life of it, the fit of it. And she surprised herself by telling him the truth, which was that she found it quieter than she had expected and harder in some ways and easier in others, and that she was still learning which parts of herself fit here, and which parts she had brought from San Antonio that did not belong in a place like this. He listened to all of this with a stillness that she had never quite encountered in a man before. Most men, in her experience, listen to women the way they listen to weather reports politely, while already thinking about something else. Vernon Bancroft listened the way someone listens when they actually want to know. He told her he had grown up on this land, that he had been to Fort Worth twice and San Antonio once, and had not felt, in any of those places, the particular pull toward elsewhere that some people seem to feel. He said this without apology or self-consciousness, as if it were simply a fact about himself, the way eye color is a fact. He said he reckoned he was made for this stretch of country, flat and dry and plain as it was, and that some people were made for certain places the way some boots were made for certain feet. And what if the place you were made for, she said, turns out not to be the place you find yourself in? He thought about that for a while, which she was already learning was something he did actually thought before he spoke, which was its own kind of rarity. I expect, he said finally, that is the harder kind of living, but I also expect you can grow into a place if you let yourself. The fiddle player switched to something slower, and around them couples paired off, and the evening settled into a more comfortable, amber-lit kind of beauty. And Virginia Baker looked at Vernon Bancroft standing there in the orange glow of the lanterns with his hat in his hands, and she thought that this was a man it would be very easy to let herself know better. Which was precisely why, on the walk home that night, she reminded herself that she was not in Redemption Creek for that. But summer turned to fall, and the school year began again, and Vernon Bancroft kept appearing on Tuesdays and sometimes Saturdays. In October he repaired the schoolhouse porch steps, which had rotted through on one end because he happened to have the lumber and happened to be in town with time on his hands, or so he said. She made him coffee on the small iron stove she kept in the schoolroom, and they sat on the newly repaired steps and drank it while the afternoon light slanted long and golden across the flat land. "It is good coffee," he said. "My sister taught me," Virginia said. She had opinions about coffee, the way most people have opinions about scripture. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and Virginia felt something shift in her chest like furniture being moved, something making room for something. They started talking more deliberately after that. Not courtship, not exactly, nothing she could name as such. But when he came to town, she would find reasons to be somewhere he would pass, and he seemed to find the same reasons, and they would talk about the town, about his cattle, about her students, about books she was reading, about the land and its weather and its particular way of demanding things from the people who lived on it. He told her once about a night his father and he had sat up through a flash flood that threatened to take the lower pasture fence line, and how they had worked in water up to their waists through 3 hours of darkness to shore it up, and how by the time it was done and the sun was coming up, his father had looked at him and said, "Well, son, I believe this land belongs to us because it has cost us enough to." He told that story with the quiet pride of someone who has carried a thing in their chest for a long time and occasionally needs to let it breathe. She told him about Thomas. Not all of it, not the debts and the shame and the particular grief of mourning a man you loved while also being angry at what he had hidden from you, but enough. She told him about the store, about San Antonio, about the way she had felt stepping off the train in Redemption Creek with her carpet bags, like a person standing at the top of a very steep hill and choosing deliberately to start climbing. He did not say he was sorry. He said he thought she had done something very hard and done it with what appeared to be a considerable degree of grace, and that he respected that more than he could properly express. She looked at him then, really looked at him and thought, "This man is going to matter to me whether I intend it or not." November brought the first cold, the dry West Texas cold that came in fast off the plains like a reminder that the country had its own schedule and no concern for human comfort. Virginia's small rented room above the Hutchins dry goods store was adequately heated by a cast iron stove, but the walk to the schoolhouse in the mornings was sharp-edged and bracing, and she began to understand the particular pleasure of hot coffee in a cold dawn. It was in November that the trouble came, as trouble has a habit of doing when everything else has finally begun to feel like it is settling. Her trouble had a name, and that name was Harlan Gill. Harlan Gill was 35 and owned a middle-sized spread northwest of town called the Flat Crown Ranch, and he had been, as Clara Hutchins described it with a certain delicacy, a persistent presence in the courtship landscape of Redemption Creek since the death of his own wife 3 years prior. He was not an ugly man and he was not a stupid man, but he was a man who had decided that what he wanted he was generally entitled to, and he had decided, sometime in the fall of 1882, that what he wanted was Virginia Baker. He came to the schoolhouse twice with flowers that he had apparently sent away for, because there were no flowers growing within 50 miles in November. He sat near her at church and found reasons to walk her to the door afterward. He told her at a November social that she was the kind of woman a man could build a future on, and he said it in the tone of someone making an offer he considered generous. Virginia thanked him for his kindness and said nothing else. She told Clara she was not interested, and asked Clara if there was a way to make this known to Harlan Gill without causing a scene. Clara said she would see what she could do, but she also said, with the wisdom of a woman who had lived in a small town for 20 years, that some men did not hear what they did not want to hear, and that Harlan Gill was particularly selective in that regard. Vernon heard about Harlan Gill's attentions through Emilio Reyes, who heard about everything that passed in Redemption Creek through a network of information that Virginia never entirely understood but had come to trust. Vernon did not say anything to her about it directly, but she noticed that on the next 3 Tuesdays he stayed in town longer than usual and seemed to find himself in the vicinity of wherever she was in a way that did not feel accidental. She did not resent it. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not resent it at all. In December, at the school's Christmas social, which Virginia had organized with the intense logistical focus she brought to anything she cared about, involving paper chains and a donated pine bough and 3 dozen molasses cookies, Vernon Bancroft came with his hat cleaned and his boots polished to a degree she had not previously observed. He stayed the whole evening. He helped carry tables. He talked to the children with the same serious attentiveness he gave to adults, and she watched him crouch down to hear what a 6-year-old named Pedro was telling him about a frog he had found, and she thought that she was in very serious trouble. Harlan Gill was there too, and he brought her a cup of punch and leaned close when he delivered it in a way she found unpleasant. She moved away politely. 15 minutes later Vernon was standing beside her, close enough that Harlan Gill, when he looked over, read the geography of the situation and moved to the other side of the room. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly to Vernon. "I wanted to hear what you were going to say about Pedro's frog," he said, and his face was completely serious, and she laughed, really laughed, and felt the evening open up around her like something unlocked. He walked her home that night, their breath making small clouds in the cold December air, the stars so close and brilliant overhead that the sky felt like a conversation she was only beginning to understand. When they reached the door of the Hutchins dry goods store, he stood for a moment and then said, quietly, without theater, "I would like to call on you properly, Miss Baker, if you are willing." She stood with her hand on the door and looked at him and thought of Thomas and the mortgaged store and the lawyers and the burned house and the long train ride and the carpet bags, and she thought of his boots polished to a shine, and his hands that fixed things and his listening that was real listening and Pedro's frog, and she said, "I am willing, Mr. Bancroft." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the winter they became something. It happened slowly and then not slowly, the way certain weather systems work, days of building pressure, and then a front that moves through and everything after is different. He called on her properly on Saturday afternoons, sitting in the small parlor that Clara Hutchins made available for the purpose with a tact and generosity that Virginia would never stop being grateful for. They talked for hours in those parlor afternoons, talked the way people talk when they are mapping each other, finding the edges and the elevations, and the places where the ground drops away unexpectedly. She told him more about Thomas, about the anger as well as the grief, and he did not flinch at the anger, did not tell her it was unbecoming. He said it sounded to him like a reasonable response to being deceived by someone you trusted, and that she was allowed to carry both things. She told him she was afraid of letting herself depend on someone again. She said it plainly, the way you say things in winter when the bare landscape makes pretense feel out of place. She said she had built something real and solid in herself over the past 2 years, something she was proud of, and she was afraid that if she let someone else into it, she might lose track of which parts were hers. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said that he had watched her for the better part of a year now, and the thing he thought was most true about her was that she was not a woman who lost herself easily. He said that he reckoned the version of her that was afraid of that, and the version of her that had ridden a train alone to a strange town with 2 carpet bags were the same woman, and that woman did not seem like the kind who got lost. She looked at the fire in Clara's parlor grate and felt something that was not quite tears and not quite relief, but was somewhere between the two. In February, he took her out to the banked fire ranch for the first time. He came for her on a Sunday afternoon with a wagon and a blanket for her lap against the cold, and Emilio Reyes' wife, Maria, who rode along as a proper chaperone with the serene composure of a woman who had done this before. The ranch was spread out low against the flat land in the way of places that have settled into themselves over time, the main house solid and square with a long covered porch, a barn and corrals and a bunkhouse for the hands, and past all of that the pastures running out toward the horizon without interruption. He showed her the house with the straightforward manner of someone showing a serious thing, not performing it. The kitchen with its big iron range. The main room with its stone fireplace and the shelf of books. She had not expected the books, a small library of them, worn-spined and clearly read. The desk where he did the ranch's accounts by lamplight in the evenings. She ran her fingers along the shelf of books and read the titles and felt, with a certainty that surprised her in its simplicity, that she could live here. She did not say this, but she felt it. Maria Reyes cooked dinner for them that evening, a proper meal of beef and beans and corn bread, and they sat at the long kitchen table and ate and talked, and Vernon told her about his father, James Bancroft, who had come to West Texas in 1858 from Tennessee with nothing but a mule and enough stubbornness to make a life. He said his father had loved this land with a ferocity that was almost frightening, had treated it not as property but as responsibility, and had passed that feeling down to him along with the deed. She asked where his mother was. He said his mother had died when he was 7, a fever, and he had been raised by his father and Emilio Reyes in equal measure, which was why he spoke Spanish as well as English, and why he had what she had perhaps noticed was an occasional Tejano inflection in his turns of phrase. She had noticed it. She had found it one of the things she liked about him, without being able to articulate precisely why. The drive back to town in the dark was cold and the stars were out, and at one point he stopped the wagon on the pretense of checking a loose trace, and in the still dark of the open land, he stood beside the wagon and she was sitting and they were eye level, and he said her name, just her name, Virginia, in the quiet tone of someone handling something careful. And then he kissed her once briefly, with the kind of restraint that is actually more powerful than the alternative. She sat very still after and then said, "You should probably check that trace." "It is fine," he said, and climbed back up onto the wagon seat, and they drove the rest of the way in a silence that was not awkward but was full of something that needed no words yet. Spring came, and with spring, the cattle drives and the long days that overtook ranching life, and Vernon's Tuesdays in town became less regular, replaced by occasional notes carried in by Emilio Reyes, which were brief and practical on the surface. Could she use more firewood at the schoolhouse? He had some spare. There was a traveling doctor coming through next week if any of her students needed looking at, and which she read 3 times each and kept in the cedar box on her nightstand. She wrote back, Her notes were longer than his, because she had always been more comfortable with words on paper than words in the air, and she told him things in writing she might have taken longer to say aloud, about her days and her students, and the particular way the Pecos River looked at sunrise when she walked past it on the way to the schoolhouse, and how she was beginning to feel, in ways she had not expected, that this flat, dry country had something in it she had not found anywhere else. He wrote back to one of her longer letters with, "I have read this 4 times. I believe this is the most honest letter I have ever received from anyone." And then below that, as if he had considered it carefully before writing it, "I am glad you are here, Virginia Baker." She put that note on top of the others in the cedar box. Summer again. The second summer. The heat was worse this year, the drought coming in hard from the south and drying the creek beds and turning the pastures to a color that made ranchers lie awake at night doing terrible arithmetic. Vernon was stretched thin through July and August, riding fence lines and moving cattle to water and working 20-hour days in the kind of slow emergency that drought produces, where nothing is catastrophic yet but everything is fragile. She did not see him as often. But he came when he could, and when he came he was tired in a way she could see in his shoulders and his eyes, and she would make coffee, good coffee, the way her sister had taught her, and they would sit on the steps of the schoolhouse in the evening and not always talk, and she found that not talking with him was as comfortable as talking had been. One evening in August he sat with her on those steps in the hot dark, and after a long quiet time said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about the future." She looked at him. "My future," he said, and then after a pause, "our future, if that is a thing you are also thinking about." She set down her coffee cup and said, "I have been thinking about it." "And what do you think?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark flat land under the stars. She thought about the cedar box and the notes in it. She thought about the shelf of books and the stone fireplace and the feeling she had had standing in that kitchen in February. She thought about Thomas and the burned house and the train and the carpet bags, and she thought about how different those felt now, not healed exactly but finished, the way a scar finishes present but no longer open. "I think," she said, "that I would like to stop being afraid." He turned to look at her. "So would I," he said, and the simplicity of it, the way he made himself just as vulnerable as she had made herself, was the thing that mattered most. He asked her properly 3 weeks later, in the parlor at Clara Hutchins's, with a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a green stone that was neither expensive nor flashy, but was clearly treasured. And she said yes before he had quite finished the question, and then laughed at herself for the rush of it, and he laughed too, and Clara cried from behind the door where she had absolutely been listening. They married on the first Saturday of October, 1883, in the Redemption Creek Church with the Reverend Hayes officiating, and the whole of the town in attendance, and Maria Reyes crying through the entire ceremony, and Emilio Reyes maintaining his dignity with great effort, and Clara Hutchins not even trying. Virginia wore a dress she had made herself from a blue-gray fabric she had sent away from a catalog, and she pinned wildflowers in her hair that the children from her class had gathered that morning, running across the flat land in the early cool to bring her what little bloomed in October. Vernon wore his best coat, which she had ironed for him the night before because it had been in a trunk and smelled of cedar, and she had a feeling about cedar trunks and ironed coats. When the Reverend said his part and Vernon said his part and she said hers, the stone church was completely silent in the way spaces are silent when everyone is holding their breath on purpose. And then it was done, and there was a general exhale from the pews and someone in the back let out a whoop that might have been Sam Dorsey, the fiddle player, and there was music in the churchyard until after midnight. The first year of their marriage was the best and hardest year. Best because of the particular joy of building a shared life, the discovery of all the small ways two people fit together and don't fit together and learn to fit, whose preference for coffee heat mattered and whose didn't, whose need for quiet in the mornings was essential and whose was negotiable, who noticed when the woodbox was getting low and who forgot. Hard because the drought continued and the cattle prices dropped, and money was tighter than Vernon had let on before the wedding, which she discovered not through any concealment on his part, but simply because he was not a man who complained about difficulty until the difficulty required practical address. She kept teaching. The school board had briefly questioned whether a married woman should remain in her position, and Virginia had addressed this question with such calm precision that the board had reversed its position without quite understanding how it had happened. She taught and she helped on the ranch in the ways she could, keeping the accounts, which she was better at than Vernon was, and which he acknowledged with the equanimity of a man secure enough not to need to be best at everything. And she learned, slowly and imperfectly, the particular rhythms of ranch life. She learned to ride, which she had not done properly before. Emilio Reyes taught her with patient humor on a steady brown mare named Pocket, and by the spring of 1884 she could cover the ranch's perimeter without assistance, which she did on Saturday mornings, while Vernon did the accounts she had finished the night before. She came in from those rides with her hair escaping its pins and her cheeks bright and her eyes carrying something new in them, a physical confidence she had not had before, and Vernon would look up from the desk, and something in his face would do that thing she had noticed in the beginning, that thing in the direction of a smile that was actually more than a smile. In June of 1884 she told him she was expecting their child. He sat very still for a long moment and then stood up from the desk and put his arms around her very carefully, as if she were newly fragile, which she was not, and she told him so, and he laughed and held her less carefully, which was better. Their son was born in February of 1885. He was 9 pounds and exceedingly loud about his opinions from the first moment, and they named him James, for Vernon's father. And for the first 3 months he overturned everything they thought they knew about sleep and time and their own capacity for exhaustion. Maria Reyes came every day for the first month and cooked and helped and told Virginia things about keeping a baby alive and comfortable that no book had ever covered. And Virginia received all of this information with the same serious attention she gave to anything important. Vernon held his son in the evenings with the careful awe of a man encountering something he did not know how to measure, and Virginia would watch them together in the lamplight and feel something so large it was almost alarming. But beneath the joy and the fullness of that year, something was moving in Virginia that she had not examined carefully enough. She had given up her teaching position when James was born, because that was how it was done, and she had accepted it with a practical nod because it was the reality, and she was not a woman who wasted energy fighting what could not at that moment be changed. But the loss of it was larger than she had expected. The ranch was everything, a full life on its face, and she loved Vernon and she loved James, and she loved the wide, flat country she had come to know as hers. But the school had been the thing she had brought to this place, the thing that was Virginia Baker before she was Mrs. Bancroft, and its absence left a specific kind of silence in her. She did not say this to Vernon. She told herself she would wait until James was older and things were steadier, and there was more room in the days for a complicated conversation. But waiting had a way of accumulating weight, and the weight, compounded by the isolation of a ranch in winter, by the worry over cattle prices that never quite recovered, by the particular loneliness of being surrounded by love and still feeling that something of herself was somewhere she could not reach, became a thing that did not go away on its own. She pulled it apart in the small hours of the night, sitting at the kitchen table after James had finally slept, turning it over with the same careful attention she had given to everything else, and what she found at the center of it was not unhappiness with Vernon or with the marriage or even with the ranch. What she found was something that had been forming for months, like weather building at the horizon, and it was this: she was afraid that she had disappeared again. Not in the way Thomas had disappeared her through deception and debt, but more quietly, more gently, through the ordinary mechanisms of a life that was built around a place she had not originally chosen, and a role she had not entirely chosen. And she was afraid that if she did not do something about it, she would one day look in the mirror and not be able to find Virginia Baker in there anymore. By November of 1885, when James was 9 months old and starting to pull himself upright along the furniture, the fear had hardened into something that felt like a decision. Not a decision against Vernon or the ranch or any specific thing. A decision for herself, for the self that had ridden the train alone with 2 carpet bags and chosen this place deliberately and meant to go on choosing it. She had written to a school in San Marcos that was looking for a teacher. She had written to her sister in Memphis. She had begun, quietly, to map out a geography of elsewhere, not because elsewhere was better, but because the act of knowing she could choose it was the thing she needed to prove to herself she still had. She had not told Vernon any of this. She told herself she would tell him. She told herself there was time. But December came and the ranch was busy and James had a cough that worried them both for 2 weeks and then cleared. And then it was Christmas, and there was no room for it. And then it was January, and the nights were long and cold and Vernon had been tired and distracted by a fence dispute with a neighboring rancher. A tedious legal back and forth that required trips to the county seat, and Virginia kept not finding the moment. Until the night of the 14th of January, 1886, when she decided the moment was going to have to be made rather than found. James was asleep. Vernon was at the desk with the ranch accounts. She came and stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at him. This man she had come to love with a depth she had not anticipated when she said yes before he finished the question. This man with the worn books on the shelf and the patient gray horse and the hands that built and fixed things. And she said, "Vernon, I need to talk to you." He turned from the desk and looked at her face, and his own face changed. The way faces change when the person who knows you best shifts into a different gear. She sat down and she told him. Not the way she had rehearsed it tidily, with prepared explanations and careful transitions. She told him the way truth usually comes out, which is in pieces, some of them not in the right order. She told him about the teaching position and what losing it had cost her. She told him about the nights at the kitchen table and the thing she had found at the center when she pulled the fear apart. She told him about the letter to San Marcos and the letter to her sister. She told him she was not sure what she was asking for, and she was not saying she wanted to leave him or leave the ranch or leave their life, but that she needed him to understand that she was disappearing in a way she did not know how to stop on her own, and that the only thing she had ever known to do when she was disappearing was move. She said she had been thinking about leaving at first light on the stage that came through on Tuesdays. She said she had been thinking about it for weeks and she had not told him, and she was sorry for that, for the not telling, because he deserved to know. He sat across from her and he listened. All of it. He did not interrupt and he did not defend himself, and he did not do any of the things that might have made her angrier or more certain. He just listened with that stillness of his that she had loved from the first year and loved still, the stillness that was not absence but presence, that was not withdrawal but attention. When she was done, there was a long silence, and outside the wind moved across the flat land in the way it did at night, steady and indifferent and vast. He said, "I need to think." She said, "All right," he said, "I would like you to give me until morning." She looked at him. She said, "Vernon, not to change your mind," he said. "I am not asking for the chance to talk you out of anything. I am asking for the chance to understand it well enough to give you something real." She looked at him a long time. "All right," she said. She went to bed but did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and the breathing of James in his crib in the next room, and she thought about train carriages and flat land, and the color of creek water in autumn and the shelf of worn books, and she did not know what she wanted except that she wanted to be whole, and she was not sure those two things, wholeness and staying, were compatible. And she was not sure they were incompatible either, and the not knowing was the worst part. She heard Vernon move around in the main room. She heard the sound of the kitchen stove's iron door and the settling of fresh wood into it. She heard the distinctive small sound of the coffee grinder, that particular rhythm of it, which was something she knew the way she knew his breathing in the dark. She heard water and the kettle set on the stove, and then the house was quiet again except for the wind. At some point before dawn she must have slept, because when she woke it was still dark, that particular dark before the sky lightens, the dark that is not night anymore but is not yet morning, the border country of night, and there was a smell in the house. It was coffee. Not just the smell of it being made, which she had heard, but the smell of it freshly poured and sitting somewhere close. She lay in the dark for a moment. Then she got up and put on her robe and went to the kitchen. Vernon was sitting at the kitchen table. He had been there for some time. She could tell by the stillness of him, the way a person looks when they have been sitting still and thinking for hours. There were 2 cups of coffee on the table. Steam rose from both of them, so he had known when she would come, or had simply made a fresh pot when he heard her stir, the one or the other. He looked up when she came in. Outside the kitchen window the dark was beginning barely to lighten at the very edge, the way the sky does before the sun itself commits. She sat down across from him. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was exactly the way she liked it, which was strong and hot, and she held it and looked at him. He said, "I have been thinking about what you told me." She nodded. He said, "I have been thinking about it wrong, I think, for a long time. Not tonight. Tonight I have been thinking about it right. But for a long time before tonight I was thinking about it wrong." "What do you mean?" He set down his cup. He looked at his hands for a moment and then looked at her. "When you stopped teaching," he said, "I noticed that you were quiet about it. I told myself it was the adjustment, the baby, the ranch. I told myself you would settle into it. I was telling myself a story I wanted to be true because the other story was harder." She was very still. "The other story," he said, "is that I asked you to build a life inside the life I already had. I did not ask you what shape you needed it to be. I assumed the shape I had already built would be enough because it was everything to me, and that was—" He stopped, looked at the table, looked back at her. "That was not right. That was the same kind of not right as what Thomas did, except it was mine. I was not trying to take something from you, but that is the thing about not trying to do harm, you can still do it." She felt something in her throat. "Vernon, I am not finished," he said, not harshly. "Please." She nodded. "I found out last month," he said, "that the school board is looking for a teacher for next term. Mrs. Abernathy is leaving in the spring. Her husband is taking a position in Dallas. I was going to bring it up, and then I kept not bringing it up because I did not know how to say, 'I want you to take that position,' without making it sound like I was trying to fix something I had not admitted was broken." She stared at him. "Emilio and Maria are here every day," he said. "They love James like their own grandchildren. I can hire another hand for the seasons that are heavy. The schoolhouse is a 2-mile ride or a 20-minute walk in good weather, and I can have pocket ready for you every morning, and on the mornings the weather is bad I will drive you myself." He paused. "And that is not the reason to stay. I want to be clear that I am not offering you a trade. I am offering you what was always supposed to be yours. I should have offered it a year ago." The sky outside the window had gone from black to that deep blue-gray that comes just ahead of the dawn. James was quiet in his crib. The fire Vernon had built in the kitchen stove had taken the chill off the room entirely, and the coffee was the best coffee she had made in months, even though it was his hands that had made it. She looked at him, this man who had listened all evening and then stayed up all night not to talk her out of a decision, but to understand what the decision was really about, and who had met her there, at the real place rather than the surface place. And she felt the fear that had been forming for months begin to move in a different direction, the way weather moves when the wind shifts. "There is more," he said, "more than the school. I have been writing to the county about establishing a small library," he said, "using part of the schoolhouse. It is early stages and I cannot promise it will happen, but I am trying." He looked at her directly. "I want you to have more than one thing here. I want there to be things in this town, in this life, that are yours the way the ranch is mine. Because the ranch is mine because I built it, and you should have things you built." She put her coffee cup down because her hands were not quite steady. "And the last thing," he said, "if there is ever a day when the road to San Marcos, or the train to Memphis, or anywhere else in this country feels like where you should be, I want you to tell me. Not to leave in the dark at first light without telling me, but to tell me, and I will listen the way I should have been listening all along. Because I would rather lose you in honesty than keep you in a silence that belongs to Thomas, not to us." Outside the kitchen window, the horizon had gone from deep blue-gray to the palest possible yellow, just a thread of it, just the very first suggestion of what was coming. The sun was not up yet, but the dark was over. Virginia Baker looked at her husband across the kitchen table in the almost light of the January morning, with the coffee he had made warming her hands, and she felt something settle in her the way the land settles after water moves through it, not unchanged, not as it was before, but firmer, better, more itself. She said, "I would like to take the teaching position." He said, "I was hoping you would say that," she said, "and I would like you to tell me more about the library." He said, "I will tell you everything I know, which is not much yet, but we can figure out the rest." She said, "Vernon," he looked at her. "I am not leaving," she said. He held her eyes for a moment that was long and real and full of everything they had been to each other and everything they were still going to be, and he said, very quietly, "I know." And then the sun came up, not metaphorically. Actually, physically, the sun broke over the flat West Texas horizon and came through the kitchen window in a long gold bar that lay across the table between them, across the two coffee cups and their joined hands, because at some point in those last words she had put her hand on the table and he had covered it with his. The morning of the 15th of January, 1886, Virginia Baker made the decision not to leave at first light. It was, in every important way, the best decision she ever made. She took the teaching position in March of that year. The school board hired her back with a minimum of discussion, partly because she was the best teacher the school had ever had and everyone knew it, and partly because James Hutchins, Clara's husband, who sat on the board, said anyone who was going to make a fuss about a married woman teaching in Redemption Creek School was welcome to find themselves a better school, and no one had anything to say to that. The first morning she rode Pocket to the schoolhouse, James was in Maria Reyes's arms on the porch of the banked fire ranch watching her go, and he waved one small fist in the air in the imperious manner of 10-month-olds, and Maria waved too, and Vernon was already out in the pasture, but he had left a note on the kitchen table that she had folded into her coat pocket where it stayed all day. The note said, "Ride safe. Come home." She came home. The year 1886 was a good year, better than the two that had come before it in the particular ways that matter, not because anything catastrophic had been avoided, but because they had found a true footing, she and Vernon, the kind that comes not from never having problems but from having worked through the real ones and knowing the ground can hold. Harlan Gill, for his part, had married a woman named Eunice that spring who seemed to suit him considerably better than Virginia would have, and Virginia wished them both sincerely well. The library project moved slowly, the way things moved slowly in small towns where committee decisions required the alignment of multiple schedules and opinions. But by the fall of 1886, a corner of the schoolhouse had been formally dedicated to it, with a small collection of donated books and a catalog Virginia had written out herself in her clear, deliberate hand. It was modest. It was a beginning. She put the first book on the shelf herself, a copy of David Copperfield that she had carried in her carpet bag from San Antonio, and she felt something that was uncomplicated and complete, a feeling she had been working toward without knowing it for a long time. Vernon came with James on the day the library was formally opened, such as it was, a short gathering, Clara Hutchins making a small speech, the Reverend saying a blessing, Sam Dorsey playing something on his fiddle in the corner more because he was there than because anyone had asked him to. Vernon stood in the back with James on his hip, and when Virginia looked across the room at him, he was looking at her with an expression she did not have a precise word for, which was something like pride and something like love and something like relief all at once. She held his eyes for a moment and then turned back to Clara's speech, and the warmth of it stayed in her chest for the rest of the day. In the fall of 1887 their daughter was born, which they had not planned but received with the same joy they had received James, who was by then a running, talking, opinionated 2-year-old with Vernon's dark hair and Virginia's creekwater eyes and an attitude about everything that belonged entirely to himself. They named the girl Alice, for no particular family reason, but simply because when Virginia held her for the first time and looked at her face, the name was there, clear and right. James examined his new sister with the judicial seriousness of a 2-year-old doing important work, and then declared her acceptable, which was the highest endorsement he had given anything that month. The drought had broken the previous year, and the cattle business had steadied, and the ranch was running at a prosperity that was not extravagant but was solid and reliable, the kind that lets you sleep through the night. Emilio Reyes had brought on his nephew, a young man named Tomas who had his uncle's skill and his uncle's quiet efficiency, and the ranch had a rhythm to it that Virginia had come to know as deeply as she knew her own heartbeat. She taught every term. The school grew a little as the town grew a little, as West Texas in the 1880s grew in the steady, incremental way of things rooting in difficult soil. She had 22 students by 1888 and 26 by 1890, and she knew every one of them with the complete and particular knowledge of someone who has chosen teaching not as a profession, but as a vocation. The library grew too. Slowly, always slowly, because books had to be sent for and donated and occasionally bartered for, but it grew. By 1890, there were nearly 100 volumes in the schoolhouse corner, and a small reading bench Vernon had built on a Saturday afternoon that she had watched him build through the schoolhouse window, with the quiet observation of a woman who has the luxury now of watching the person she loves do something he is good at, and who does not take that luxury for granted. Harlan Gill's wife Eunice came to the library once a week and had become, to Virginia's genuine pleasure, one of her most dedicated borrowers. There was a satisfaction in that, in the way the world rounds off its rough edges sometimes. James turned 5 in 1890, a year the country was changing fast. The frontier line officially declared closed by the census takers in Washington, though you would not have known it standing on the porch of the banked fire ranch looking out at all that flat wide sky. The world was changing, but the sky was not, and some mornings Virginia stood on that porch with her coffee, always good coffee, always exactly the right heat, and felt the enormity of the sky above her and felt, in the precise middle of it, entirely herself. She had found what she came looking for. She had found more than she came looking for. She had found a place that was hers because she had chosen it and kept choosing it. Through the dark mornings and the ranch winters and the long accounts and the moments of fear that were not gone but were manageable now, held in proportion by everything around them. Vernon found her on the porch one morning in the spring of 1890, a morning when James was already up and in the barn with Emilio doing whatever it was a 5-year-old did in a barn to Emilio's patient amusement, and Alice was still sleeping in the way that 3-year-olds sleep when they are finally, deeply down, and the ranch was quiet, and the sky was the pale gold of early morning, and everything smelled like the season turning. He came and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and she handed him her coffee without asking because he had never in 4 years of marriage made himself his own cup before coming to find her, which she had figured out somewhere in the first year was because he preferred to share hers. He stood beside her and drank her coffee and looked at the morning. After a while she said, "Do you ever think about other places?" He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "Not often." "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That surprises you." "A little," she admitted. "I thought I was made for moving. I thought that was the thing I was. And now—" She looked at the flat gold country running out to the horizon, and the pale, enormous sky over it, and the porch they were standing on that he had repaired in 2 places, and she had repainted last summer, and the barn where her son was learning something from a man who had been on this land longer than either of his parents, and the house behind them where her daughter slept, and the shelf of books inside, and the kitchen where coffee was made before sunrise on the days that mattered. And she thought about a woman on a train with 2 carpet bags and the determined conviction of someone who had decided to start climbing. "I think," she said, "that I was made for choosing. And I keep choosing here." He handed her back the coffee cup. She took it. Their hands held the cup together for a moment in the morning light. "Good," he said. The years that followed were the years of building and growing and the particular dailiness of a life that is rich not in events but in substance. The ranch expanded modestly in 1891 when Vernon bought a stretch of adjacent land from an older rancher who was retiring to his daughter's family in Kansas City. Emilio Reyes's nephew Tomas married a young woman named Rosa from Pecos, and she became part of the household in the way Maria had always been, bringing her own cooking and her own practical warmth, and her own opinions about the right way to preserve tomatoes, which differed from Maria's in one particular detail that was the subject of good-natured and ongoing debate. James Baker Bancroft grew up fast the way children on ranches grow up, knowing the names of things and the weight of things, and the consequence of things earlier than city children do. By the time he was 8, he could ride well enough to be useful, and by the time he was 10, Vernon was taking him out on the range with the same deliberate, patient teaching that Emilio had once given Vernon. And Virginia watched her son come in from those days, sun-darkened and tired and proud in a way that was not arrogant but was earned. And she thought about fathers and sons, and the particular way certain kinds of knowledge pass from hand to hand across generations. She thought about Thomas sometimes, still. Less often now and differently, without the sharp edges of the grief and the anger, which had both worn smooth the way stones wear smooth in water, into something she could hold without being hurt by. She thought about what he had been to her and what she had been to him and the life they had made and the way it ended, and she thought that grief, properly carried, eventually becomes a kind of map, a record of where you have been that helps you understand where you are. She was here. She knew where she was. Alice was a different creature than James, quieter and more interior, with a gift for sitting still and observing that Virginia recognized as something like her own. She came to the schoolhouse sometimes in the afternoons and sat in the back while Virginia taught and watched with those creekwater eyes that were her mother's eyes. And Virginia would occasionally look up from the lesson to find her daughter watching her with an expression of complete attention. And it was one of the things in her life she would never be able to properly articulate, the feeling of being watched with love by your own child, the strange and circular beauty of it. By 1893, Virginia had been teaching in Redemption Creek for 11 years, counting the time before her marriage. She had watched 3 classes of students complete their education in that schoolhouse and move on into the world, some to other parts of Texas, and some to places she could only imagine, and she had seen them carry things out of that room that she had put there, not facts, not arithmetic, but the particular posture of mind that comes from being taken seriously as a young person, from having an adult invest in your ability to understand the world. And that was the thing she had always wanted to do and had done, and it was enough, more than enough. In the winter of 1893, the community of Redemption Creek put on a gathering in honor of the schoolhouse's 25th year, which predated Virginia by some time, but gave the occasion shape. Clara Hutchins, who was the organizing force behind most of what happened socially in Redemption Creek, arranged a dinner in the church hall and invited everyone, and had Sam Dorsey's son play the fiddle because Sam himself had passed away in 1890, and his son had inherited both the instrument and the gift. They made speeches. Several of them were about Virginia, which embarrassed her in the straightforward way of someone who has worked for the work and not for the recognition. Clara spoke longest and most eloquently about what the school had become under Virginia's hand, and about the library, which was now over 200 volumes and which Clara described as the intellectual heart of the community, which Virginia thought was generous but also not entirely wrong. Vernon sat beside her through all of this, and at one point she felt his hand find hers under the table, the simple warmth of it, the simple fact of it. Later that night, riding home through the cold under the abundant West Texas stars, with James riding ahead on his own horse because he was 12 now and rode ahead naturally the way 12-year-old boys do, and Alice asleep against Virginia's side in the wagon, and Vernon beside her with the reins. She thought about the night in January 7 years ago when she had sat at the kitchen table in the small hours and told him the truth about what was disappearing in her, and about the morning that followed it. The coffee on the table and the dark going light at the window and the sun coming through in a bar of gold. She thought about what it had taken to speak the truth of herself. She thought about what it had taken for him to hear it. She thought that love, the real kind, the kind that lasts, the kind that weathers drought and silence, and the hard arithmetic of two people trying to make one life, was not the story of how people found each other. It was the story of how they kept choosing each other in the particular ways that each of them needed, which required knowing what the other person needed, which required the hardest thing, which was asking and telling the truth. She leaned her head for a moment against Vernon's shoulder. He shifted his arm to accommodate this without changing the angle of the reins. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "First light," she said. He was quiet for a moment, understanding this, which was another thing about 14 years of loving someone. They understood the shorthand. "Good morning," he said. "The best morning," she said. And that was that, and it was true. The banked fire ranch continued to hold in the years that followed. The name had been given to it by Vernon's father, James Bancroft, who had said when he built the first fire in the first hearth of the first structure on that land that a banked fire was the only kind worth having. It did not burn high and dramatic, but it kept its heat through the long, cold dark and was ready to build from when the morning came. Virginia had always loved the name for this reason, and she loved it more as time passed, because she thought it was not only a name for the ranch, but a description of the kind of love she and Vernon had made together, the kind that was not always spectacular but was always warm, always there, always ready. James graduated into ranching with the full weight and seriousness of a young man who has grown up understanding what the land costs. By 15, he was riding with the seasonal cattle hands as a working member of the operation, and he had Vernon's eye for the land and Virginia's discipline of attention and Emilio Reyes's patience, which was perhaps the best inheritance the ranch could have offered him. Alice took after her mother in the schoolroom direction. By 12, she was the most avid reader in the library. Virginia was no longer surprised when she came to the schoolhouse on a Saturday and found Alice already there, sitting on the bench Vernon had built, absorbed in something from the shelf. She read everything, indiscriminately, the way good readers do when they are young, and the habit is being formed history and novels and agricultural almanacs and anything else that was there. Virginia watched this with a pleasure that was beyond pride, which was the pleasure of a thing you built being used exactly the way you hoped it would be. In 1895, Virginia found herself writing another letter. This one was not to San Marcos and not to her sister in Memphis. It was to the County Board of Education, proposing the expansion of the Redemption Creek School into a 2-room facility that could accommodate the town's growing population and provide a secondary level of instruction for older students who currently had nowhere to go after completing the primary curriculum. She wrote the letter the way she had always approached the school board, with calm precision and a complete avoidance of sentiment in favor of evidence, which was that there were 11 students in Redemption Creek between the ages of 14 and 17 who were currently receiving no formal education because the system had no place for them, and that this was a waste of capacity that the community could not afford. The county board approved the expansion in the spring of 1896, allocating funds for the construction of the second room. Vernon and Emilio and Tomas and two other ranchers who had children among those 11 students built the room themselves over 3 weeks in May, which was practical and economical, and was also, Virginia thought, watching them work, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, that many people giving that particular kind of effort to something that mattered. The day the second room opened, Virginia stood in the doorway of it before the students arrived and looked at the 2 desks and the blackboard and the new maps she had tacked to the wall and the small shelf she had already seated with a dozen books that were too advanced for the primary class, and she felt complete in a way that did not negate anything that had come before it but gathered it all up and said, "Yes, this is what the effort was for." She taught that room herself for the first year, splitting her days between the primary class and the secondary, which was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. In the second year, she brought in a young man named Mr. Calloway, who had come to Redemption Creek as the new minister's nephew, and who had a college education from a school in Missouri, and a great deal of enthusiasm that needed useful direction. He took the primary class, and she kept the secondary, and the arrangement suited everyone very well. James finished his education in that secondary room in 1898 and immediately went back to ranching full-time, which surprised no one and disappointed no one, because the ranch was his vocation the way teaching was Virginia's, planted deep and clear. Alice finished in 1900, the first year of the new century, and did the thing that surprised everyone but should have surprised no one, which was that she applied for and received a scholarship to a women's college in Waco. Virginia helped her pack with a combination of pride and the particular bittersweet feeling of a thing you raised flying off in the direction it was always meant to go. And Vernon stood at the station when the stage came through, looking at his daughter with the same careful awe he had turned on her mother long ago, and on his son, and on the ranch, and on everything he loved, that measuring reverent attention of a man who knows what things cost and what they are worth. Alice came back for Christmas and for summers, full of new ideas and new vocabulary and a growing certainty of her own direction, which was toward teaching, which Virginia received with the emotion of a full circle and the intellectual satisfaction of a proof completed. The 20th century came in, and the world continued its changing. The railroad had improved, and the cattle markets had shifted, and there were new ways of doing old things appearing at the edges of everything. And Vernon watched all of it with the same measured attention he had always brought to change, neither resisting it nor being swept up in it, but placing it in relation to the land and the ranch and the life, and deciding, piece by piece, what was useful and what was not. In the winter of 1901, Emilio Reyes sat Vernon down on the porch of the ranch house and told him that he was getting old enough to need to say something. And what he needed to say was that he had watched Vernon's father build this place, and then watched Vernon carry it forward, and that it had been the central work of his own life to have a hand in that, and that he was proud of it in the way only someone who has helped build something real can be proud. And that Tomas was more than ready to take over the day-to-day running of the ranch operations, because Emilio's knees had decided to have opinions he could no longer ignore. Vernon heard this with the full weight of its meaning, and told Emilio that there would always be a place for him on this ranch for as long as he wanted it, that it was as much his home as it was the Bancrofts', and that nothing was going to change that. Emilio nodded in the way of someone who already knew this, but needed to hear it confirmed out loud, and they sat on the porch for a while after, in the long silence of two men who have done serious work together for a long time and do not need to say everything they feel. Virginia made coffee for all of them that evening, herself and Vernon and Emilio and Maria, who was 62 now and moved with more deliberateness than she had and still had opinions about tomato preservation. And they sat at the long kitchen table and ate Maria's food, and talked the way people talk when a chapter is ending and a new one beginning, with the mixture of memory and forward-looking that is its own kind of grace. James married in 1902. Her name was Catalina Reyes, which was Tomas's daughter and therefore Emilio's granddaughter, and the symmetry of it was not lost on anyone. She was 22, solid and steady and funny in a dry way that reminded Virginia sometimes of Vernon, and she had the good sense to love James without trying to change him, and the good sense to learn ranch work with the same seriousness that James had learned it. Virginia received her as a daughter with the simplicity of someone who knew what this household required of the people in it, which was mostly honesty and the willingness to work, and Catalina had both in abundance. They married in the same church where Virginia and Vernon had married 19 years before, with the Reverend Hayes's successor officiating, and old Sam Dorsey's son still on the fiddle and half the county in attendance. Virginia sat beside Vernon in the front pew and felt time folding over itself in the way it does at weddings when you are old enough to hold your own wedding in memory while watching someone else's, and she held Vernon's hand and he held hers back, and it was as simple and as complete as anything had ever been. James and Catalina's son was born in 1903, which made Vernon a grandfather at 53, a fact he seemed to find both entirely natural and faintly astonishing. They named the boy James Vernon Bancroft, which was his grandfather's name and his father's name collapsed together, and he was a loud and determined and thoroughly beautiful baby who was immediately and completely adored by everyone on the Banked Fire Ranch, including the horses. Virginia held the baby on the porch of the ranch house in the autumn of 1903 and looked out at the flat gold country she had been looking at for 21 years, and thought about a woman on a train with 2 carpet bags and the stubborn conviction of someone starting over. And she thought about first light and coffee on a table, and the sun coming in through a kitchen window. And she thought about choosing and being chosen, and about the particular way a life builds itself when you let it. When you stop being afraid of it and let it be real. The baby grabbed one of her fingers in his whole fist and held on. "Hello," she said to him. "Welcome to the Banked Fire Ranch." He had Vernon's dark hair already, the beginnings of it, soft and dark against his small head. Alice came home for Christmas that year and announced at the dinner table, with the directness she had from her mother, that she had accepted a teaching position at a school in Austin, and that she planned to apply the following year to the new teachers' college program that was being established there. Virginia looked at her daughter across the table and felt something expand in her chest that had no name except continuation. The thing you feel when you recognize your own effort reproduced and going forward into a future you will not entirely see. Vernon raised his glass of water. They had moved away from the stronger stuff years ago, after a particularly bad January that was more weather-related than the month deserved, and said, to Alice Bancroft, who never met a book she did not improve. Everyone raised their glasses. Alice looked at her father with the expression of a young woman who is trying to appear unaffected and not quite managing it. "Thank you," she said, "both of you, for everything in that schoolhouse." Virginia said nothing. She did not need to. The cedar box on her nightstand was still there, the notes in it still there, the first one on top still folded the same way it had been folded in the spring of 1883. "I have read this 4 times. I believe this is the most honest letter I have ever received from anyone. I am glad you are here, Virginia Baker." She was here. She had been here in every possible sense of the word for 21 years. On a morning in the spring of 1904, Vernon saddled 2 horses before dawn, which he had been known to do on occasions he considered worthy of marking. Virginia came out of the house in the early dark to find Pocket's daughter, a mare named Silver, steady and willing, saddled and tied beside Dust's younger replacement, a dark bay gelding called Compass who had Vernon's color preferences and his father's patience. "Where are we going?" she said. "The North Ridge," he said. "I want to show you something." The North Ridge was a slight rise, nothing dramatic. This was West Texas, and dramatic topography was not on offer. But it was the highest ground on the Banked Fire Ranch, and on clear mornings you could see a considerable distance from it. They rode in the pre-dawn dark, the horses moving with the sure-footed confidence of animals who knew this land well, and when they reached the rise it was still dark, but the east was beginning to change, that slow categorical change from black to blue to the pale borderless gold of imminent dawn. They sat their horses on the rise and watched it. The sun came up. It came up the way it always did over the flat country, not gradually but in a rush, a sudden arrival of gold that lit the land for miles in every direction, catching the dry grass in amber and laying long shadows from every fence post and mesquite tree and slight undulation of terrain, making a world of light and shadow out of what had been dark. Virginia sat her horse in the light and felt it on her face and looked at everything it illuminated: her ranch, her country, her life. And then she looked at Vernon, who was looking at her. "This," he said simply. She knew what he meant. He meant, "This is what I wanted you to see. This is what I wanted you to have always wanted you to have been working toward having words adequate to, and this morning is what I have instead of words." She looked at him in the full morning light, this man at 54 who was the same man who had picked up 2 bags of flour and asked her which direction, who had listened all night and made coffee before dawn, and offered her back herself when she had almost given up finding herself, who had built a reading bench on a Saturday and named a horse patient names, and loved their son and daughter with the same steady gravity he gave to everything, who had shared her coffee for 20 years because he preferred hers and never pretended otherwise. She said, "I chose right." He looked at the horizon. "So did I." The morning held around them, wide and gold and permanent in the way that mornings are not permanent but feel that way in the right light, in the right company, on the right land, at the right moment of a life that has been lived honestly and chosen freely and built with the material of 2 people who kept deciding, in all the small ways and all the large ones, that this, right here, right now together, was where they were meant to be. The Banked Fire Ranch kept its name for reasons that kept being true. The fire kept, the warmth held. Through the years that followed James and Catalina's second child, a daughter they named Virginia, which made the original Virginia cry and deny that she was crying. Alice's eventual return to Redemption Creek with a degree and a teaching practice, and a quiet and capable man named Mr. Daniel Hargrove, who wrote poetry in his spare time, and who Alice loved with a certainty Virginia recognized. Emilio Reyes's peaceful death at 81, at the Banked Fire Ranch, in the room he had occupied for 40 years, with Maria and Tomas and Vernon beside him, and the whole ranch paying its respects with the seriousness of people who know what is owed to someone who helped build everything they stand on. The library growing until it had its own small building in 1908, dedicated in a ceremony where the county board called it the Baker Library, and Virginia stood at the podium with tears she also denied, and a complete inability to speak for 30 seconds, which was the longest 30 seconds of her adult life. Through all of it the ranch held and the fire kept, and Virginia Baker, who had once packed 2 carpet bags in San Antonio with the determined conviction of a woman who had decided to start climbing, walked out onto the porch of the Banked Fire Ranch in the mornings for more years than she could have imagined from the window of a Southern Pacific rail carriage, and held her coffee, and looked at the enormous flat gold sky, and was exactly where she had chosen to be. Which was, in the final accounting of things, the whole story. Not the coffee, though the coffee mattered. Not the first light, though first light was when everything changed. Not even the staying, though the staying was the thing. The whole story was the choosing. That Virginia Baker had come to a place she did not know and found a man she did not expect and been offered a life she could not have designed, and had chosen it, not blindly, not passively, not without cost or fear or the particular difficulty of being fully known by someone, but with her whole self, eyes open, every morning for the rest of her life. And every morning, without exception, there was good coffee waiting.